Get the dead rat out. I don't need to anymore. It doesn't smell bad. The thing is, I used to use a dead rat as an alarm clock, actually, for my stream. Because basically what happened was, whenever the sun would come up, it would start cooking the corpse of the rat, and then it would start smelling again, and then the smell would wake me up. So I would use the rat effectively as an alarm clock, and as soon as it got hot enough, it would wake me up, and then I would know, oh shit, it's time to stream.
German students threw tens of thousands of books into a huge bonfire, right here where I'm standing.
My understanding is that they burned them not because it was gender stuff, but because it was written in Jewish and not German.
Übergebt alles Undeutsche dem Feuer gegen Klassenkampf und Materialismus.
Like a retaking of Germany for Germans. That was like the uprising of the Nazis.
Following the anti-Jewish boycott in 1933, they drew up a plan that they wanted to tie in directly with this action of the boycott of the Jews.
Deciding what categories of books in these university libraries.
Let's get to the categories.
Count as un-German. They didn't see themselves as suppressing.
Un-German. Let's go back and watch the original clip. And it was like a retaking of Germany for Germans. This is it.
Program to eliminate foreign influence, the purified German culture as they saw it.
That's right.
They set up their own campaign, which was called Action Against the Un-German Spirit.
But the best that I can do is to offer a measured and, to the best of my ability, educated perspective on why these things happen. These people are not your allies. They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways. It is that simple. No, I don't feel bad for them. I don't feel sorry for them. I don't care. I'm not one of these deniers. I think the probably happened. I think probably 99% certainty it happened.
Well, how much is a dollar worth, right?
Yes.
What will be the social consequences of mass immigration to a country?
These very questions are what troubles the AfD, as the foreigners that make up 15% of Germany's population account
for... The only reason why they have trouble with the answers for the solutions to these things are because the solutions would get them put in jail.
And now for something completely different.
What's the point of books? Sure, they contain information. Sure, they can teach you about everything from history to philosophy to how to fuck good. But at what cost? Yes, some books are cool and based. Some books tell stories about stuff everyone likes, like witches and Spider-Man and junk. But some books are for gay people. So should they exist? Should we be allowed to learn more about 10% of the population? Well, obviously not. At least according to the good people of 1930s Germany, a society 21st century America has decided we should all be imitating. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that everyone's least favourite form of glue-bound paper is going to end up burning to ash in the Americas. I mean, it's not like every American has to read a book about book burnings at school or anything. Besides, even if they did, it's not like it counts if the books you're burning are gay. I've not taken a philosophy class in America, but I'm pretty sure it goes a little bit like this. Books should not be burned. Unless they're woke books. What's a woke book? Well, obviously, it's any book I personally don't like. And that's not a stance that contradicts my statement that no book should be burned. Because if I don't agree with a book, it obviously doesn't count as a book. After all, I grew up on cool non-woke books, like The Hunger Games, a book obviously about how America is cool and good and has no problems. And I was taught to read by Reading Rainbow, which wasn't woke because I watched it when I was 5 years old, and everyone knows that Reading Rainbow was a show about how dangerous it is to let gay people read. As the theme song goes, I can be anything as long as I'm straight, white and male. Otherwise, I have a designated social role I must not step out of lest I be considered a communist. Take a look, it's in a book, but not a Reading Rainbow because rainbows are woke. At least I think that's how it went. You'll have to excuse me, dear viewers, I'm not actually American, or someone who believes any of the things I just said. I'm Brigitte Empire, science and culture correspondent for the only newspaper in Britain that cannot burn, because each issue is held together with the souls of 1,000 interns, and I'm here to talk about how Americans, and one American in particular, misunderstands or intentionally misleads people about one of the most famous book burnings in world history, and how his audience's reaction reveals the darkest parts of American society that are coming to the fore, even if he chooses not to see them himself. You see, the American right has been on a bit of a book banning spree the last few years, especially when the books in question are about trans people, gay people, or black people. And this obviously has made people reflect on that famous book burning of much of the early research into trans people and queer people in general at the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft in Germany, which the Nazis burned because they saw queer people as degenerate parasites that are un-German, before sending gay people to die in the camps. Or at least, that's how I would recount these events in a snappy sentence, but I'm not #1 political commentator on Twitch, Asmongold, former video game streamer, and now host of DEI equals die watch-alongs, and also occasionally far-right commentary.
They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture.
All of which he covers on the massive streaming platform Twitch. In between, of course, his two favourite pastimes of using a dead rat as an alarm clock.
I used to use a dead rat as an alarm clock, actually, for my stream, because basically what happened was whenever the sun would come up, it would start cooking the corpse of the rat, and then it would start smelling again, and then the smell would wake me up.
And being a climbing wall for cockroaches.
Oh God! Get him out of me! What are you doing, bro? Get out of my, go in the garbage can. I'm gonna take him downstairs.
What happened is that a rat got in there and it died. And so I was like, man, this smells really bad. We've got to deal with this problem with the dead rat in that room. So I closed the door.
Asmongold, brave as he is, took it upon himself to educate his massive audience about the Nazi book burnings.
And to the best of my ability, educated perspective on why these things happen.
Something that he clearly knows a lot about, given that when he spoke, he revealed he knew literally nothing about it.
Educated perspective.
He should have explained how a huge percentage of the 20th century's research into trans people was burned in these book burnings by bloodthirsty fascists. Except that instead of actually explaining that, he said that the books weren't burned because of gender, but because they were written in Jewish.
The Nazis burned books on gender sciences.
They did do that.
First. Now the administration has villainized and marginalized migrant workers, trans.
It's a bit of a like my understanding is that they burned them not because it was gender stuff, but because it was written in Jewish and not German. And it was like a retaking of Germany for Germans. That was like the uprising of the Nazis. So it was like, yeah, they were. I think it probably might be both in some circumstances, but like it was categorical for it not being written in German. And no, a lot, and I wish people like this. It's disappointing that you can't have genuine conversations because people try to just like kind of, like handpick facts and like not talk about things in an honest way. But it's like part of that's true, but it's like not completely true.
Educated perspective.
Now obviously denying that these books were burned because they're about gender, when obviously they were because the Nazis said they were, is fucking weird. But saying that they were burned because they were written in Jewish is, well, it should be the weirdest part of all of this. If his chat hadn't responded to this man spreading dangerous misinformation about one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the transgender community, making up excuses for Nazis that are 1, wrong, and 2, rely on the existence of a language called Jewish, by revealing themselves to be about 1 bad day away from organising their very own beer hall putsch. And in case you think I'm being hyperbolic, here are some choice words from the most cool and normal community on Twitch. W Nazis, W Adolf, damn Nazis based, good, based, gotta give them that bro, W for Nazis I Wes? So they weren't all that bad. The only good thing Nazis did, Kanye W. Let them live in North Korea for a year. I bet they'll remember what gender they are. And that's a good thing. You know what? That is a plus. Not enough. Based-ga. Yes, it was written by Jews. Is that considered a Nazi W? Giga-based. Gender stuff is Jewish. It was incredibly based. Entitled mentalists. So, just so I don't lose my mind at how far we have all fallen as a society, let me explain who this cockroach man is, then what the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft was, and the truth of what Asmongold is wrong about here. And then we'll debunk the lies he told in this clip, likely more out of ignorance than of malice, and then we'll explain why, even then, doing even soft revisionism out of ignorance is not an excuse, and why it's terrifying and a real bad sign for society that this guy is the biggest political commentator on the biggest streaming platform in the world, when he's clearly so ignorant about the topics he's covering as if he's an authority.
Educated perspective.
So, just for those of you who have a life, and who, unlike me, don't recognize this face as the man who made the switch from being angry about boobs being too small in video games to being the least informed political commentator since the dawn of goddamn time, Asmongold, real name Zach Hoyt, is a prolific Twitch streamer and the co-founder of streaming organization One True King, or OTK, who began his career making videos about World of Warcraft before switching to full-time streaming gameplay and later switching to social commentary and politics, the latter of which he is just truly out of his depth in. In fact, you might remember a controversy involving him coming up a few months ago, when he called Palestinians a terrible people from an inferior culture.
So no, I'm not going to cry a fucking river when people who have baked into their laws are getting I don't give a fuck. They're terrible people. It's not even a question. It's crazy that people don't see it that way. They'd be doing the same thing. And how much do they? As many as they can. They're not able to people as Israel because they don't have as many weapons. But if they did, they'd be doing the same thing. That's it. Just takes enough. That's right. These people are not your allies. They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible for their identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways. It is that simple. No, I don't feel bad for them. I don't feel sorry for them. I don't care. I don't support them.
Needless to say, he keeps putting his foot in it on social issues, because he just has no idea what the fuck he's talking about when it comes to politics. But it does pull in viewers, and those viewers have grown increasingly far-right, and seem to have pulled him right along with them as he tries to please them. Aside from that, well, he quite famously never cleans his house. He used to have a dead rat in his room that he uses as an alarm clock because it would start to stink when the sun came up, and he was caught on stream with a cockroach climbing over him, so clearly the kind of guy you want to be going to get your political opinions from. Someone who never leaves the house and has the personal hygiene of a fat, sweaty turd. And that's before we get into how he knew so little about the Nazi book burnings, particularly that very famous one where they burnt all the research on trans people to a crisp and set back the queer community almost a century of progress in a bloodthirsty rage, that he accidentally did a bit of revisionism.
Anyway, I'll read the first post here, and this is Asmongold asserts that Nazis burned down the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute of Sexology in 1933, not because it was a safe space for queer people, but because it was written in Jewish, not German. That's actually not what I was talking about. This person's just actually completely wrong. I was talking about the book burnings.
On the subject of said book burning, let me explain to you what exactly Asmongold was talking about. Which books did the Third Reich burn? And did they burn these books because of the gender thing? Yes. Yes, they did. They would tell you such. And they certainly weren't written in Jewish. Firstly, because that's not a language, but secondly, I can actually show you what language they were written in. That answer might surprise you if you're Asmongold or if you're anti-Semitic. If you're not either of those things, it won't surprise you because they were written in German, obviously. Look, here is one. But to put a long story short by way of gay community news, the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, or Institute for the Science of Sexuality, is widely recognized as the first sexology research center in the world. At its peak, more than 40 people worked at the Institute, which housed a major archive, research library, museum, medical examination rooms, and a lecture hall. Magnus Hirschfeld, founder of the Institute, was at the forefront of research into trans issues, with a sexologist coining the term transsexual in 1923. Trans people were employed by the Institute, and were also able to access essential services that were not available anywhere else, including facial feminization surgery and facial masculinization surgery. Trans people and cross-dressers faced arrest by police in the city, when wearing clothing deemed only suited for people assigned a different gender at birth. Transvestite passes were issued by the Sexology Institute that trans people could show to police to avoid arrest. Hirschfeld became well known for his outspoken advocacy for LGBTQ+ rights, and founded the first LGBT rights organization called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1897, which was based at the centre before it was destroyed by Nazi supporters in 1933. The institute was targeted as part of widespread book burnings of so-called un-German and degenerate literature during the Third Reich. On May 6, 1933, just months after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, members of Nazi student groups ransacked the institute in an organised attack. Thousands upon thousands of books, documents, and other items were stolen from the building, with the interior defaced and virtually destroyed. Following the looting by Nazi students, members of the Sturmabteilung, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, joined the attack and pulled out what was left inside the archives and library to burn. Before the book burning, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels gave a speech to the assembled students, Hitler Youth members and other Nazi groups, saying, "The era of exaggerated Jewish intellectualism is now at an end, and the future German man will not just be a man of books. This late hour entrusts to the flames the intellectual garbage of the past." While estimates differ, it's believed tens of thousands of books were burned on May 10th in the Babelplatz public square. Books written by authors such as Maria Remarque, Heinrich Heine, Karl Marx, and Albert Einstein were also destroyed. These events may have taken place more than 90 years ago, but for Brandy Schlates, medical historian and editor-in-chief of BMJ Medical Humanities, the parallels between the 1920s and the 2020s are impossible to ignore. It simultaneously sounds a warning, explains Schlates. Anti-LGBTQ joined anti-Semitism as two planks of the Nazi platform. They used hatred of the other to fuel their rise. It can happen again. Hate crimes start with those in the fringes, but they do not end there. It's difficult to quantify exactly what has been lost from the destruction of the Sexologist Institute. However, it is clear that a great deal of early research and personal testimonies of LGBTQ+ people have been eliminated during the attacks and book burnings.
They burned them not because it was gender stuff, but because it was written in Jewish and not German.
To the best of my ability, educated perspective on why these things happen.
This followed, according to the book Homosexualität in der NS-Zeit and the ever-reliable folks on the Ask Historians Reddit, the Berlin newspaper Lokalanzeiger announcing the beginnings of a purging of all libraries and institutions of books of un-German spirit.
Count as un-German. They didn't see themselves as suppressing...
Un-German.
This does not mean they were written in Jewish. Un-German is the word they use for stuff they don't like, much like certain people use the word woke, or DEI. These library purges would start, wouldn't you know it, with the Institute of Sport purging the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaften. At around 9:30 arrived a lorry carrying the 100 sports students in a brass band. While the brass band played German marches, the students stormed the institute and began an orgy of destruction, spilling ink over the carpets, busting doors and bookcases, destroying exhibition pieces used in the 1930 London Medical Congress, destroying papers, stealing art books, and playing football with images and framed photographs. They thoroughly destroyed the interior of the institute. When one passerby interjected that all this material was medical research, the students openly proclaimed that their concern weren't the books per se, but the complete and utter destruction of the institute itself. Around noon, Hitler gave a speech celebrating the destruction of the institute.
Anyway, I'll read the first post here, and this is Asmongold asserts that Nazis burned down the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute of Sexology in 1933, not because it was a safe space for queer people, but because it was written in Jewish, not German. That's actually not what I was talking about. This person's just actually completely wrong. I was talking about the book burnings.
Denying this event is considered, by the way, denial and a crime in Germany. And altering the facts to change this narrative is considered revisionism. It is also, as outlined in this paper by Matt Fuller and Leah Owen for the journal Peace Review, an act of memoricide, that is, the willful destruction of the memories and cultural treasures of an adversary. This wanton destruction was part of a move to erase trans people from society, by destroying their very culture itself, a process that, at least in part, eventually ended, as with many of the victims of the Third Reich, in attempted extermination. So how do we get from this horrific crime, one of the first major steps in the eradication of queer Germans, who eventually, albeit in much smaller numbers, were thrown into concentration camps alongside the Jewish, Romani and disabled populations of the Reich, to some cockroach-infested streamer denying these events and telling his audience of thousands that this book burning actually happened because the books being burned were written in Jewish. In short, how the fuck did we get here?
Well, I don't think there are any Nazis here. That's what a Nazi would say.
I know that Asmongold became the biggest political streamer by just being the biggest video game streamer to shift to political topics, so I'm not asking about that much is obvious. But how did we end up in a place where it's deemed acceptable to not just spread such obvious misinformation, but to pander to literal Nazi sympathizers, to the point of denying history, making up languages, and spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about how all research on trans people was written in Jewish, when, surprise surprise, the research at the Institute wasn't written in Yiddish or Hebrew, which if I'm being extremely charitable, Asmon must have meant by Jewish, but in German. And we know this because a couple of these documents the Nazis burned had duplicates, and they survived, and they are written, not in Jewish, but by the same language the people burning these books spoke. German. Like this book, Tranvestititen, by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. As you can see, this book isn't written in Yiddish, nor was it written in Hebrew, which I believe at this point was restricted mainly to religious usage for the most part, and therefore you probably wouldn't have had science books written in Hebrew anyway. Literature in Hebrew was pretty rare up until the 1940s.
In fact, the first Hebrew dictionary wasn't completed until 1959, 11 years after Israel was founded. And just think about the fields of medicine, science, and law. Entire dictionaries needed to be written to cover new concepts that hadn't even existed when the Bible was written.
Unless you want to deny this too, in which case you'll have to explain to me what's Jewish about this text, which, even just looking at it, makes me want to bust out my worst German accent and swig a Pilsner. I mean, just look at this. Vorwort! This is a seminal text in the history of the transgender community. And even I can't read Seit langem ist die erste Auflage der Tranvestiten vergriffen without craving a Bratwurst.
It makes me want a hot dog real bad.
Now, Magnus Hirschfeld himself was Jewish, and he was the face of the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft. But that doesn't mean the work done in the Institute was written in Jewish, or was somehow fundamentally Jewish, as the Nazis would argue. Or that it wasn't, as Asmon puts it, in Germany for the Germans, because Hirschfeld was a German writing in German for Germans that happened to be queer and Jewish, and it was those last two things that made him an enemy of the Third Reich. And apparently an enemy of Asmongold's audience, who, if their comments are to be believed, would happily repeat that very same history in their own countries if they happened to end up within 3 inches of a book about trans people and a lighter.
W, Adolf. Damn Nazis, based. Good. Based. Gotta give them that, bro.
W for Nazis, I guess? Now, if I'm being extremely charitable, I might assume that Asmongold heard about how Nazi officials talked about the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft as un-German and completely misunderstood what they meant. So if that's the case, let me clear that up now. Un-German does not mean it was not written in German or involving Germans or doing research for and by Germans. It means the research they were doing was considered to be un-German because homosexuality, transgender people, and Jewish people were all considered to be un-German based on the insanely narrow view of what it meant to be German that Hitler and the Nazis enforced. You might recall that there were many millions of people who didn't fit the ideal of what it was to be German. Hence all the Jewish people, Romani people, disabled people, queer people, socialists, Slavs, all sorts of people who were considered not German enough to deserve to live and were sent to camps. In fact, the idea of the German as a heterosexual white male, with its opposite, the deviant, the feminine, as un-German, despite the obvious implications of denying full national identity to more than half the population, is absolutely key to understanding the German nationalist project, from its origins in the quest for German unification, to its zenith in the fascism of the Third Reich, to its modern-day neo-Nazi resurgence. As the book Gender in Germanness puts it, what is un-German helped to lay the groundwork for an understanding of national identity based on difference and exclusion, an identity that supported the idea of a superior, male, German racial identity. Or, if you prefer, according to Scientific American, the Nazi ideal had been based on a white, cis-het, that is cisgender and heterosexual, masculinity masquerading as genetic superiority. Any who strayed were considered as depraved, immoral, and worthy of total eradication. What began as a project of protecting German youth and raising healthy families had become, under Hitler, a mechanism for and this did not simply go away, and as with the other hate crimes that came to a head in the Third Reich, ill treatment of queer people increased in stages. It was not straight from a couple of homophobes to whoops, all concentration camps. Nazis absolutely would, and did, as is the case with the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, burn down your entire research library because of gender stuff. Yes, they were violently anti-Semitic, but they didn't need an anti-Semitic excuse to hate other minority groups. In fact, their whole ideology is rooted in an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that all other minority groups are under the thumb of the Jews. So all their hatred is interwoven with anti-Semitism. The evil of the Nazis was not limited to their Jewish victims, though they certainly suffered the most and lost the most lives in the horrors of the regime. Already in 1933, we see homophobic and transphobic narratives that are reflected in our modern day on the rise. As the book Hidden describes, there were 4 major reasons given by the increasingly loud bigots in German society as to why queer people were inherently inferior. Reasons that I'm sure Asmon Chat would call giga-based. 1. Inability or refusal to beget issue. With every homosexual, a potential producer of children was lost to the nation. 2. The danger of corruption of young people, and hence the possibility of epidemic spread. 3. The tendency to form cliques. Every homosexual was suspected of being a potential oppositionist, and thus regarded as an enemy of respectable society. 4. The endangering of public morality. Sexual relations between people of the same sex were supposed to impair the sense of shame, thereby undermining morality and encouraging the decline of the social community. This all added up to an important, subjective, prerequisite of Nazi policies, namely, the self-justifying contention on the part of the perpetrators that their victims were in acute and immediate danger to the rest of the population, and that serious measures therefore had to be taken against them. A major role was played by various eugenic concepts, seeing male homosexuals as an immediate threat to the growth of the nation. National Socialist ideologues partly blamed them for their lower birth rates, and preached the need to make optimum use of the generative power of the male population. In this way, they supplied ideological justification for all the intended, and eventually implemented, forms of persecution. The eugenic aim of putting the hereditary flow in order, by eliminating that which is unhealthy and undesirable, and blocking the reproduction of inferior blood, was the basic drift of measures that were designed and eventually put into operation against homosexuals as well as other groups. The declared aim of the Nazi regime was to eradicate homosexuality. To this end, homosexuals were watched, arrested, registered, prosecuted, and segregated. They were to be re-educated, castrated, and, if this was unsuccessful, exterminated. In the 12 years of the National Socialist dictatorship, the arsenal of repressive measures devised in support of its population policy became ever more extensive. They included the ordering and carrying out of police activities and of measures designed to instill terror, the sharpening of penal sanctions, the creation of special administrative bodies to carry out prosecutions, deportation and isolation in concentration camps, extension of the grounds for compulsory castration, and the organization of paramedical experiments up to and including reversal of hormonal polarity. These things might sound familiar, because the bigotries that build the Third Reich are alive and well today, and they are resurgent in the United States of America right now, along with many other countries, where erasure of minorities is currently being fast-tracked through public institutions, soon to be followed, if the current regime isn't stopped, by what followed it in Germany. That is, violence against those same minorities, sanctioned by the state. Let's go back to the book burning that started this whole saga in the first place, and place it in its proper context. In the timeline of persecution of LGBT people in Germany, from discrimination, to erasure, to violence, to the camps. From the Auschwitz exhibition. On the 6th of May, 1933, students directed by the SA entered the Institute of Sexual Sciences in Berlin. 4 days later, its irreplaceable collection of over 12,000 books and 35,000 images, together with thousands of others classified as degenerate by the Hitler regime, were burnt in a large bonfire in the centre of Berlin. It was the first in a long series of measures to eradicate gay and lesbian culture. The episode was followed by the closure of mythical bars like El Dorado, and the prohibition of publications like Die Freundschaft, the creation of pink lists, and the establishment of a broad legal framework for the persecution of homosexuality, which meant that even intentions and thoughts could be classed as indecent criminal activities between men, punishable by indefinite imprisonment without trial. However, just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, on the 4th of April 1938, the Gestapo publicly announced that men condemned for homosexuality could be deported to concentration camps. Between 1933 and 1945, acting under the orders of Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, the police arrested around 100,000 men suspected of the crime of homosexuality. Half were sentenced and sent to normal prisons. Between 5,000 and 50,000 of these were interned in concentration camps and marked with a pink triangle. In a time when history is looking to repeat itself, albeit an ocean and a century apart, it is imperative that we do not downplay the crimes of the Third Reich, say trying to explain them away as being German for the Germans. That we learn from our history. We learn what is coming, so that we can defeat it before it is too late. Right now, there is still plenty of time to stop it getting to this point in America. But when you deny the crimes of the Nazis against gay and trans people by making excuses for example, the massive book burnings of research on us, and the burning down of one of the few places we can go to get the help that we need in the world, you are at best being a useful idiot for fascists, and at worst, becoming complicit to the point of being a collaborator. Things can get worse. And we have the history behind us to know what happens when people like those egging on the Third Reich in your chat get their way. In fact, behind me right now is a pink triangle. This particular artwork is by the gay American artist Keith Haring, painted decades after the camps, during the AIDS crisis, in the era where the pink triangle was flipped upside down and reclaimed as a symbol of resistance, resilience, and a reminder that history, this history, will not be allowed to repeat itself. Back in the 1940s, the pink triangle was the symbol that gay people sent to the camps were marked with, as opposed to, for example, the yellow Star of David the Nazis used to mark their Jewish victims. Trans people too were marked with the pink triangle, as the Nazis, unlike Magnus Hirschfeld, often saw no distinction between gay people and trans people, or at least didn't for the sake of punishment. Maybe if they had read Hirschfeld's work instead of burning out pure homophobic and anti-Semitic rage, they would have had to come up with a second symbol, but either way, we would have been sent to the camps, as we were. In fact, here is a photograph of gay people imprisoned in Sachsenhausen, a place I have actually visited, and let me tell you, there's nothing quite like going somewhere where crimes against humanity were committed and feeling the weight of the horrors in the soil and the air around you, and then years later, seeing anonymous internet dipshits rank themselves silly at the thought of doing these horrors again in the 21st century to you and yours. I have to believe, Asmongold, that this is not the kind of community you want to foster, and I suggest you take steps to remedy this, or they will only grow louder and push you further and further. If you need another image to haunt you, I was recently in Slovenia, and in the Slovenia history exhibit, I found this uniform with a pink triangle on it, and this picture of a man sent to the camps. You need to take action now before this gets way out of hand. Get better mods for a start. That would help, but clearly you are out of your depth here, so don't talk about this stuff. This isn't a discussion about titty size in video games. You can't just go off on one about Nazi book burnings without any prior knowledge. In this subject, and with, let's be honest, a lot of these political issues you've been covering lately, you are dangerously ignorant, to the point of actively spreading misinformation which could cause harm to others. And when you don't know what you're talking about, it's better to say nothing than to put your foot in your mouth. If you actually read up on what you were talking about, or just stuck to things you're qualified to speak about, you wouldn't end up in positions where you end up making disgustingly racist comments about Palestinians, or, as you have done this time, whether knowingly or not, engaging in a form of revisionism. Because that's what it's called when you change historical narratives to lessen the crimes of the Third Reich's horrors. Magnus Hirschfeld's research was written in German. That is not why the books of the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft were burned. They were burned because the Nazis believed research into trans and other queer people was un-German, and therefore was to be purged, precisely because of the, as you put it, gender stuff. Even if it had been written in Jewish, or Yiddish, as the actual language I was assuming you were referring to is called before you said it was Hebrew, in which case it definitely wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have made an iota of difference to the Third Reich. They were there to stamp out what, in their eyes, was degeneracy, and a big step towards their eventual plan for queer people in Germany, to throw them into camps. And we know what happened next. In his memoirs, Rudolf Hess, commandant in Auschwitz, describes how the camp guards would often assign homosexuals to some of the most dangerous jobs, and they were sometimes separated from other prisoners to prevent homosexuality being propagated to other inmates and guards. Judges and officials at SS camps could even order the castration of homosexual prisoners without consent. The SS doctors also performed cruel experiments on prisoners to cure them of homosexuality. In fact, these tests resulted in illnesses, mutilations, and even the deaths of inmates, but produced no scientific knowledge. Even though there are no definite statistics on the number of homosexuals murdered at the Nazi camps, they're especially vilified and singled out for punishment. Of the 400,000 people officially recorded at Auschwitz, only 75 received pink triangles. However, thousands of homosexual men and women were murdered during the Third Reich. And you might be looking at this and saying, well, that says homosexuals, that's nothing to do with gender. But as I said earlier, the Nazis rarely made such a distinction, and what's possibly more important, the people that wrote the histories and the people who won the war were also not big fans of trans people either. And so while persecution was less well documented and often more obscured, although if you look into the evidence you will find it, not just in the burnings of Hirschfeld's Institute either. From Transgender Life and Persecution Under the Nazi State by Dr. Lauri Mauhofer. Nazi officials generally had negative views of transgender people. In what may be the only Nazi-era book on the topic, Ein Beitrag zum Problem des Transvestitismus, Hermann Ferdinand Voss writes, "The asocial mindset, which is often paired with criminal activity, justifies draconian measures by the state." Prior to the Nazi seizure of power, not enough could be done about trans people, he wrote. But happily now, there is a possibility of putting the people in question in protective custody, or possibly having them castrated, or via temporary appropriate detention, to impress upon them that they must put their inclination on hold. In 1933, Hamburg officials wrote, "Police officials are requested to observe the transvestites, in particular, and as required to send them to concentration camps." Historians now recognize the category transvestite corresponded very closely to a modern concept of transgender. Moreover, Nazi officials did not simply think trans women were gay men. They recognized trans women as different from gay men in ways that mattered. Nazi officials had a concept of transvestitism as distinct from, though related to, homosexuality. To quote Voss's 1938 book, "By transvestites we generally mean those persons who have the wish to primarily wear the clothing of the other sex and to act more or less as the opposite sex. In all the cases I've examined, state officials referred to the accused people as transvestites, even when they also identified them as homosexual, which they did not always do. Officials also claimed that transvestitism was an aggravating factor, something that made the case more dire, the accused person more deserving of a heavier sentence. In general, transgender people who could distance themselves from homosexuality were more likely to get off with a warning from police. Yet I have seen cases in which transgender people whom police deemed heterosexual nevertheless suffered. One such case is ours. Police forced her to detransition and she spent time in a concentration camp." Now, following all this coming out and receiving understandable backlash, Asmongold did come out with a response. That response, however, kind of only made things worse. He did accept that he misspoke when he said that the books at the Hirschfeld Institute were written in Jewish, and clarifies that he meant in Hebrew, which they almost certainly wouldn't have been.
They burned them not because it was gender stuff, but because it was written in Jewish and not German.
Which was me misspeaking, I meant Hebrew.
It was like a retaking of Germany for Germans. That was like the uprising of the Nazis.
Right, a retaking of Germany for Germans.
If they had been written in a language commonly used by Jewish people in Germany, they would have been written in Yiddish. The revival of Hebrew as a language was still ongoing at this point in history, and would not be widespread in literature until well after World War II. But that shouldn't even be part of this discussion, since the books were written in German. And we know this because many of these documents had duplicates that survived when the original manuscripts were burned. But at least he acknowledges that he was wrong in that small way. Even while not realizing the anti-Semitism of accepting the Nazi propaganda at their word that these books were burned because they were Jewish, which, after witnessing his explanation, I'm even more convinced than ever that this is what he thinks, because he completely buys the fascist explanation for why these books needed to be burned, that being because they were un-German. Just listen to this clip where he pretty much accepts that narrative wholesale.
Me saying that these books were burned not because they were about gender specifically, but just because they were non-German. Why don't we look it up and why don't we find out for ourselves? How about we watch the video?
So you have committees of students.
So this is exactly what I said.
Meeting with professors together, deciding what categories of books in these university libraries.
Let's get to the categories.
Would count as un-German. They didn't see themselves as suppressing.
Un-German. Let's go back and watch the original clip. And it was like a retaking of Germany for Germans. That was. This is, again, my source for this is the Museum.
Now, it shouldn't have to be said, but gay and trans Germans were still Germans. Jewish Germans were still Germans. You are not performing a gotcha by saying, see, the Nazis said that they were taking back Germany for the Germans. That is you uncritically accepting the propaganda of the literal Nazis during the literal Holocaust. And then you wonder why people think that you might be a fascist. Even most fascists don't come out with this kind of stuff in public, because they realize it'll make it obvious to everyone that they agree with the horrific fascist ideology of literally Nazi Germany. What does Germany for the Germans mean? Well, we know that, from the sources I've gone through in this video, it means Germany for straight, white, cis, able-bodied men only. By agreeing with this, which you say you do, you are saying that you agree this is what being a German is, and that being anything else is un-German. And no matter how much you try to sugarcoat it, you are, at that point, agreeing with fascist talking points, and embracing a fascist worldview. And in case you're about to object and say, well, that's not actually what Asmongold thinks, remember, here is a clip of him saying, this is exactly what I think. And I think they're 100% right. To an explanation of the book burnings as eliminating foreign influence and purifying German culture as they saw it. He then points and claims victory at the narrator, saying that these books were considered un-German. Un-German does not mean these books were not written in German or were not by Germans. It means that they were on subjects the Nazis wanted to eliminate. Subjects and peoples that were German and indeed an integral part of German culture. This is not a gotcha, Asmon. You are categorically wrong. And you thinking un-German means anything but people who need to be thrown into camps shows exactly how unqualified you are to be talking about any of this, to the point of this being dangerous. This is how you cultivate a far-right audience. Whether knowingly or not, you are spreading far-right talking points. And you will appeal more and more to the far-right as people who do not agree with these talking points peel off, unable to stand hearing this fascist propaganda from someone they used to look up to, someone they used to respect. This is how 4chan's Polbold went from a place with occasional Nazi jokes to a forum for Nazis. And this is how a bar becomes a Nazi bar. When Nazis begin to gather somewhere, if you don't make it clear they're not welcome, more of them will come, and more of them will feel comfortable there. As they do, more and more normal people will leave. I am of course here referring to a semi-viral thread on Twitter from 2020 that's become a core piece of internet philosophy in the years since. And it goes a little something like this. So I was at the shitty crust pump bar once getting an after-work beer. One of those shitholes where the bartenders clearly hate you. So the bartender and I were ignoring one another when someone sitting next to me and he immediately goes, "No, get out." And the dude next to me says, "Hey, I'm not doing anything, I'm a paying customer." And the bartender reaches under the counter for a bat or something and says, "Out. Now." And the dude leaves, kind of yelling. And he was dressed in a punk uniform, I noticed. Anyway, asked what that was about, and the bartender was like, "You didn't see his vest, but it was all Nazi shit. Iron crosses and stuff. You get to recognize them." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And he continues. "You have to nip it in the bud immediately. These guys come in and it's always a nice, polite one. And you serve them because you don't want to cause a scene. And then they become a regular, and after a while they bring a friend, and that dude is cool too. And they bring their friends. And their friends bring friends, and they stop being cool. And then you realize, oh shit, this is a Nazi bar now. And it's too late because they're entrenched, and if you try to kick them out, they cause a problem, so you have to shut them down." And I was like, oh damn. And he said, "Yeah, you have to ignore their reasonable arguments because their end goal is to be terrible, awful people." And then he went back to ignoring me, but I haven't forgotten that at all. I can't forget. This is what's currently happening in Asmongold's community. Except it's worse, because not only is this streamer cultivating a community that finds people that say W Hitler acceptable, but he's actively going along with them, allowing himself to be influenced by his chat, and accepting the arguments of the literal Nazi party wholesale. And even after all this, even in his correction, Asmongold is too ignorant to understand how wrong he is. He goes back to the video he was watching to check whether he was right about books being burned, not because they're about gender, but because they were non-German. And he says this like he's talking about them not being written in German, and from what I can tell that's his understanding, But un-German does not mean it in the German language, as we've already established. And acting like the Nazis calling studies of trans people non-German proves his point is either actively malicious or stupid to the point of being evil purely by accident. Either way, for someone with 3.4 million subscribers on YouTube alone, this is dangerous, and will actively allow Nazi apologia and fascist ideology to spread, at a time when that is already very much an active and ongoing risk, with or without him adding fuel to the fire. So, having now listened to that, you can probably understand why I'm done giving people who run cover for the persecution of queer people or any people under the Third Reich the benefit of the doubt. If Asmongold was some guy at the pub, I could argue with him, or tell him that he's wrong and explain how. I'm very forgiving for people in real life. But he's not. He's a public figure. He's a massive streamer with a ridiculously large audience for someone so pitifully uninformed. At a time when we need people to speak out against these crimes now more than ever. This isn't the time to be handling people who play down the crimes of the Nazis with kid gloves. This is the time when we need people with knowledge of history and knowledge of how to fight it when it comes knocking once more. Those are the people that need audiences. My doorbell camera's ringing like a motherfucker, and damn it if it doesn't look like an American Nazi Party tribute act is waiting on the other side, insisting that it'll be different this time. Well, excuse me if I don't believe that they won't burn our books, won't arrest us, persecute us, and worse. Because those of us who know our history aren't so willing to let it repeat. And frankly, if you're so hilariously uninformed, do you think the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft was burned down not because of its subject matter, but because its books were written in Jewish? You should not be on stage talking about politics at all. Go back to talking about video games. I'm sure some board member is suggesting taking jiggle physics out of Dead or Alive beach volleyball. For the love of God, talk about that instead. You're still wrong to be mad at that too, but at least not downplaying the crimes of the Third fucking Reich. For the rest of you, do not jiggle gently into that good night. Goon! Goon at the dying of the light! And thanks for watching. Still from employees hiding overseas, catch water flow, set them on fire. Christian archetype, credit, genotype, but the phenotype, set them on fire. Roll with your rich makers, paper and what do you expect? Set them on fire. Recording your disease, enemy of history. Go gather your treasury, we'll set this town on fire. Ashes on your knees, have a taste of misery. Break the chains of poverty, you set this town on fire tonight. Take from the rich, give to the poor, that's all that we're asking for. Either we get Robin Hood or give you gasoline. Take from the rich, give to the poor, that's all that we're asking for. Either we get Robin Hood or give you gasoline. Take from the rich, give to the poor, that's all that we're asking for. Either we get Robin Hood or give you gasoline. Hey, thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. Yeah, I admit this was on a subject that's not exactly happy, but sometimes it has to be done. If you like this video, give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe, tell your friends, share it all around, and give me some money. Maybe I should be, well, I'm more qualified to talk about this subject than Asmongold is, at least, so you should pay me more than him. That'll be quite difficult. He's quite rich. But you can try on Coffee or PayPal, links below as always. Or sign up to my Patreon, where you'll get early videos, access to the members only Discord, and this is a Switch friend code, exclusive content such as long form interviews with some cool YouTubers, and your name read out at the end of each video, just like these lovely people. Lee Wilkins, George Geddes, Kira B, No Sparkling Heart, Corey, Matt J, Mighty Than the Sword, Carolyn, Imogen Q, Luciano Frias Andrade, Adam, Harry, Ndog 191, Cav, Quesadilla de Tortilla Azul, Leron, Adam Lees, Daniel Nevels, Nonella, Paul, MB, Madeline Guire, Ben Murphy, Lex Phoenix, Enter Credits, Mirror D, Jade Senior, Boa Ear, James W, Marvin Orr, Thorngill, Bob the Builder, 544-5554, Deborah Laboon, Vegas, Zillas Athenaeum, Vince Whitaker, Amelia Lissette, Jason Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helena Real, Sierra Whiskey, Erestria, Ali Catgill, John N, Lloyd Luciente, Jason Cribbett, Shield Dayton, Ron Podolsky, Turtle Tomb, Casual Observer, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philippa Brogger, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Artie Wolf, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexandra Lilly, Howard Locke, Never Near Scarjan, and Joey Cobalt. My friends, thank you for being here. And enjoy the jiggling. I'm not going to jiggle. That'll get my video banned. Will it? If it won't, maybe I'll do it.
Gasoline, ashes on your knees are your only history. Go gather your treasury, we'll set this town on fire. We're the cure to your disease, enemy of history. Break the chains of poverty, set this town on fire. Take from the rich,